Nocn vLearn launches to all Nocn Group centres for programmes, qualifications and bespoke accreditation. vLearn is a custom-branded, easy-to-use virtual learning environment to empower your tutors and learners by utilising the most cutting-edge technology, including a learning management system, digital content, artificial intelligence and chatbots. The following topics will be the first to launch: tutor support for qualifications and bespoke accreditation, assessment materials and mock examination content, hundreds of ready-to-go digital learning courses. vLearn provides all of the features you need in one place. All of this for only £20 per month per centre, learner fee for only £2 per learner per month. Contact your Nocn Group account manager at business-inquiries@nocn.org.uk to become a part of the vLearn experience. Nocn vLearn.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. I trust that you can see me. That's me, and hear me this morning in what is week 5 of our in-depth webcasts in a series of 6. So the penultimate webcast this morning. You have a little questions box which you can type into to let me know that you can see and hear me okay. You should also see my first slide here and therefore know that you are in the right place at the right time for an in-depth webcast, as I say, in week 5 for the FE white paper. Hi Steve, hi Darren, hi Catherine, great to have you on the line. We'll just use a couple of minutes now to make sure that you are all working your way around the technology okay. I'm sure many of you will have done this before. Hopefully some of you will have been tuning in live to this webcast for the last few weeks, or perhaps even watch some of the videos. All of this will be recorded and made available to view later as well. Hi Carol, hi Alison, hi Paul, hi Carol, another Carol, hi Susan, hi Nigel, Tina, Jess, good morning all. Hi Adele, hi Bridget. We have about 600 or so on the line at the moment, so I'm going to stop reading out names now, but it's great to have so many of you on the line and giving me a little wave hello. I hope the weather's looking as beautiful where you are as it is where I am in southeast London. Looking out the window at lovely blue sky. Anyone been on all 5 now of these webcasts live? This is the 5th webcast in the last 5 weeks on the FE white paper. Oh, well done Tracy and Brendan. Right, you get a shout out if you've been on all 5. How about that? This could go on a while. So as I say, we just use 1 more minute or 2 just to make sure that everybody is in the system. And if you can't hear me, you won't hear me saying, turn up your sound, because everything's to be working well. And as I've already mentioned, we will be recording this so that it can be played back later as well. Bridget has been on all 5, Monica's been on all 5, Nigel has been on 5, Lynn on all 5, Kay on all 5, and so on. Fantastic. So this is the running order as advertised. So I'm going to do, as I have done for the last webcasts, I'll be doing an overview. I've created a bunch of slides to do the overview for this chapter 4 in the FE white paper. Rather a long named chapter, this one. Responsive providers supported by more effective accountability and funding. Or just accountability and funding, or responsiveness and accountability, you could summarize that as. So I'll be doing a little overview, and I have produced some slides for that. Those will be shared with you as well, along with the recording. I'll keep mentioning the recording, but someone in about 5 minutes will put a message in the questions box and saying, "Is this being? Will I be sent the recording?" but yes, you will. So I'll be doing a little summary, and then we will be hearing from our webcast partner. Delighted that NOCN Group has partnered with FE Week for these webcasts. So the Chief Executive there, Graham Hastings Evans, will be giving a little view in terms of the white paper in this chapter. And then we come on to our VVIPs, our special guests, our very, very important people. So we're very selective with these webcasts. We did actually have lots of people come and ask if they could be on our in conversation parts of these webcasts, but we've been super selective. So for this particular chapter, we have hopefully, for the obvious reasons, given the information in the chapter, and if it's not obvious now, it should become obvious once I finish my summary why we've selected these three individuals. So we'll be hearing from Fiona Chalk, the National Head of Governance Development at the ETF, and Kurt Hall, the Governance Advisor for the Association of Colleges, and Mark Taylor, who is a lawyer, partner, so a very senior lawyer, very experienced working with colleges in the main and some independent training providers, but certainly a further education specialist lawyer from Eversheds, Sutherland. So that's order of play. You have a little questions box some of you have been tapping into. By all means do that. We'll try and have a little bit of a conversation with you as well, as part of the, particularly as part of the in conversation with section with our VVIPs. So please have that in mind as I go through my material. If you've got comments or questions or anything pops into your head, please do share those. Only I see those, and I'll kind of make a judgment call as to whether to bring them up during our conversations. Okay, let's get going. So just a couple of slides that I've started with. So a bit repetitive. Apologies for those of you in particular who have said that this is your fifth. You've got all the badges. This is your fifth webcast. But I just start with a couple of slides to kind of ease us into this particular chapter. The first one here is just to make a point, which I've been making every week, that this is a very, very wide-ranging white paper for post-16, mainly adult vocational education skills policy. So we all love our numbers. I know you know that I love my numbers. So in numbers here, we have 6 chapters, including the summary, hence the 6-week webcast series, of which this is week 5. 32 sections within the chapters, 34 policy decisions, so very wide-ranging across the 80 pages and so on. So that's really the point here. But there are particular things that we perhaps didn't know. Much of it we did know. It was a reform program in train already. Some of it has been in train for about 6 years, if you consider the chapter on apprenticeships. But I think it has been very useful with this particular white paper to oh, hello Kurt, good to see you. We'll catch up with you. If that's all right, just to switch your webcam off, we'll be catching up with you on the in conversation with. Brilliant. So very wide-ranging, and some new policies in there. A lot of it we already knew, but helpful to bring it all together. I think what's really important though to note, and hopefully it's not passed you by, is this is a white paper, and we haven't had a white paper in over a decade. And that's very significant, as I've been saying, that the fact that it's not just a policy document, it's not just a Department for Education, another kind of consultation or document about their intent. It's specifically a white paper. That means it's got cross-governmental support, but perhaps more significantly, it means it will come with new legislation, new primary legislation. In fact, the government at the moment are recruiting staff to draft the bill. I'll call it the skills bill. I think that's what they're going to call it. I've been referring to it as the FE bill, but I think it's going to be called the skills bill. In fact, I noticed even right now, if you look on the civil service jobs website, you'll see they're recruiting an apprentice to support the drafting of the new bill. So it'd be useful to have a little chat with our governance advisors and lawyer later. Obviously, they'll be very familiar with the legislative process associated with how government do their thing, which is what's coming next. So really big next step after this white paper is to see the detail of the bill. That will then get debated in Parliament, may get amended and changed in either house or for whatever reason. So still all to play for. We're talking a bit more about that obviously on this webcast in week 5. The next slide was for me again, to repeat and reinforce the point, although this is not the particular emphasis of the chapter that we're covering this morning, it is for me the point and why we have a white paper. Everything else is a little bit window dressing. For me, the point of the white paper is a new way of strengthening links, a lot of between the employers and the providers, particularly colleges. And I think what I'll be saying, as you'll see with this chapter 4 about accountability, is this white paper is about colleges. It is about strengthening links with employers. In many ways, nothing new there. Many of you will have been rolling your eyes. I've heard lots of people saying, oh, we've heard this before, but actually what's new here, I think, is the fact that it will come with legislative powers for the Secretary of State to intervene if he feels that colleges in particular are not doing what they're told by the employers. By the employers, I mean the local employee groups, perhaps the local chambers of commerce who have written the local skills improvement plan, or perhaps the local enterprise partnership. We're not entirely clear yet in all the different localities and regions exactly who these employer groups are going to be. Lots of unknowns. We don't really know exactly what those intervention powers are going to look like yet. That's obviously to be written and debated in Parliament, but that's where the legislation is going to be absolutely key, and why we have a white paper. So for me, a new way for the government to try and solve a problem that they have not been able, they would say they've not been able to solve to date. So they've tried incentives, they've tried curriculum reform. If you look at the apprenticeship curriculum reform, but they would say that employers, that colleges and training providers are still not. Their argument is are still not plugging the skills gaps. They're still not delivering the courses that employers need. Is the criticism of the providers. I think the criticism of always of the employers is they're not investing enough. So maybe if they feel they have the weight of the law on their side, as it were, then the college training providers will do what they are being told to do. That's quite controversial, but it is certainly the plan. If you tuned in to week 1, then you will have heard Keith Smith, the author, architect of this white paper, really in conversation with me, really, I think, putting his hands up and saying, fair enough, yeah, this is exactly what is being planned, but we don't have the detail yet because the Secretary of State needs to decide what that legislation is going to look like. It needs to be written and so on and then debated. So it's quite cautious, but he did kind of verify that plan, as it were, because in many ways the white paper is quite cautious about describing that intervention through that legislation, but that's the plan. Do watch the video back. We'll send out a link to all the videos. That is online at the moment. Do watch that back from week 1. So that's the main point of this white paper. But we're not going to cover that first chapter, which for me is the point of this white paper in the main, in the sense that that's why it needed to be a white paper. The other chapters, including this one, there is a bit of possibly legislative change as part of this chapter we can talk about later, I'll mention. But really, this particular chapter 4, I think much of it probably absolutely could have been, and is even some of it, being introduced, whether there's legislation or not. So let's have a look at this, more responsive and accountable providers. That's what we'll be covering today, and then next week is the last chapter, and I'm still hopeful that Professor Alison Wolfe might join us at some point as well, who I would say, alongside Keith Smith, he's at the Department for Education as their lead on post-16 strategy, and then Professor Alison Wolfe, a name very familiar to you, hopefully. She did a very important paper in 2011 on 14 to 19 skills for the government independent review. She was then very instrumental in the Lord Sainsbury review on the panel there. She was then very instrumental on the Lord Auger report into FE and HE funding. And for the last year, she's been working 4 days a week within number 10 on all of this. So alongside Keith Smith, Alison Wolfe is absolutely a key player in number 10. This is very much being a cross-departmental thing. And actually, even if you look at the job adverts at the moment, they're quite interesting. I always try and look at DFE job adverts because they sometimes give away future plans when they're recruiting staff. And it's very clear in there that alongside responding to COVID, this FE bill is the top priority for Gavin Williamson, Secretary of State. Very much, he's got his name on on this as this kind of big thing. So who knows what might happen if he's shuffled off in the summer, but this is very much a top priority for him, and no doubt that's in part because it's a top priority for number 10, as I say, with Alison Wolfe in there and others driving this agenda. So let's consider chapter 4. Here is chapter 4 in terms of the subheading sections. So I'm going to just walk us through what I think are the main parts. I'm sure you've read this already. I'm not going to tell you anything particularly that hasn't been published, but useful, I think, just to summarize particularly chapter 4 before we do the in-conversation. And I'll try and pull out on these slides the key bits for me, and put a little bit of spin on it as well in terms of my own views for what it's worth. So we'll just start with, I think, a key paragraph within the sort of the way that these chapters are laid out is you get this kind of summative section before the sub-chapters, as it were. So in the summative section, this is a key paragraph, I think, and it very much, for me, you may disagree, but for me, it very much highlights that this white paper is about, and particularly this chapter, but I really do think this white paper, as I've said before, is about colleges. It's not about the independent sector. This is a college's white paper. So I've kind of tried to flag by using the color red here, the word colleges, but also that, because throughout the paper it talks about further education providers, but it reveals itself at key points as being about colleges. And as you can see here, the fact that they are, and I quote, at the core of their local communities and economies. And this very much chimes with Alison Wolfe's view, not the biggest fan of the independent private profit-making sector in FE, despite how much provision they deliver, particularly in the workplace space, apprenticeships and so on. But yeah, I mean, I don't need to read the full paragraph for you. You can read that for yourself. So this chapter is about, as it says, creating a funding and accountability environment. So giving you the money and the freedom whilst also being accountable, and squaring that circle is where that is, as it were, has always been a challenge. I remember, gosh, I worked at Lewisham College for 7-8 years, so I'll probably get the year wrong here, but I remember back in about 2004, 2005, I think it would have been under, so it would have been under the Labour government. I remember the kind of agenda back then with white papers. There was one in 2006, definitely. I was a couple of years then. And if you go back and have a look at those, which I haven't done recently, but I have a weird memory that remembers some things and mostly nothing. But there's some things it does remember, includes the fact that there was a real push back then to give colleges more freedoms and flexibilities, and that's what this is basically saying. And it was talking then about 3-year funding agreements, and I think there was a strapline, trust for all, seems to ring a bell. I don't know if any of you have been in the sector long enough on the line to remember trust for all. Did I make that up? It's just popped into my head. I might have to Google that and see if I imagined that or not. Trust for all has popped into my head. So there's very much a trust for all, trusting thing. And obviously, that's what the college sector was pushing for. But how do you square that circle with accountability? It's public money. What if the colleges don't do with the money what the government want them to do with the money? And that's what this white paper is trying to do. And this chapter in particular, it's trying to say, we'll trust you to do the right thing, and we'll define what the right thing is, and then we'll hold you accountable to the right thing. So that seems to be the kind of shift now, is to say the right thing will be determined by the local employers in these local skills improvement plans and by the equivalent involved authorities, presumably, and then we'll hold you accountable to those things. And as we'll talk about, this may well be finally a move in terms of accountability towards some of those things being some form of metrics towards around progression and outcomes like employment, because the FE sector has, as long as I've been in it, about 20 years, has really, the accountability has come down to did the learner pass the qual or not, But as Amanda Spielman at Ofsted has said, whether you agree with her or not, if they're all passing creative courses and there are no jobs for those individuals, then is that a success? In fact, I remember when Matt Hancock, obviously now our Secretary of State for Health, when he was the skills minister, he personally demanded that the name of the success rate be changed. This is back in about 2016, I think. The name of the success rate be changed to be called an achievement rate, because in his view, it wasn't a success to have passed the qual. More was needed than just passing the qual, such as a progression or movement into work. So we could see a move there, as you'll see in this chapter we'll come on and talk about. So as I've said, for me, interested in your view on this, for me, this chapter makes it very clear that the white paper is about the college sector, not about the private training providers, and it's about the colleges. For me, I think it's about them being prioritised, at least in terms of the policy, to be held accountable, but given freedoms to be at the core of their local communities and economies in delivering skills provision and filling the gaps as they see them. So this first chapter, another nice long and meaty title, a new model for autonomous. So autonomous seems to be the new word for freedoms. Same, very much. I'm very much getting flashbacks, as I say, to previous white papers about 15 years ago. I know I look very young, but I've been doing this a little while. So autonomous and accountable providers. So that's the squaring of that circle. Can you be both autonomous and accountable? Interesting question. Maybe that's a PhD thesis right there. I'm sure I'm not the first to have thought about squaring that circle. That meets local and national skills needs. Again, do we have two oxymorons in one sentence? And is it new? Fascinating header for a chapter. Do we have two oxymorons, and is it even new? It probably is a model. We'll give them that. So just going to, movie away. That's a typo. That's me, not them, I think. Move away from complex funding rules, ring fences, and reporting, which places unnecessary burdens on providers. We want to trust good providers. So, yeah, this. I mean, who would argue against simplification? Not many. I do sometimes, if by simplifying things you make it less fair, and that tends to be what happens. I like drawing a little graph where fairness is on the decline when simplicity is on the rise. Because when you make things simpler, you take out things like disadvantage uplifts or program weightings or area cost uplifts, these things that have been put in there to make the funding formula fairer and arrive at a funding value that is appropriate for the delivery. But these things that do that are complicated. They are what keep me in business trying to explain them. So maybe I would say this, wouldn't I, to keep me in business? But when you take out complexity, I think you do need to acknowledge that it will be less fair. If you pay everyone the average, then those that will be being paid a lot more before will get paid a lot less. Those that will be being paid a lot less before will be being paid a lot more, which may raise questions about good use of public funds if you're paying even more for the same product. So it's actually not as simple, and I've done this for probably 4 times. I've seen this happen in my career over 20 years, 4 times probably at least. I've seen that cycle of ripping everything up from the funding formula and starting again, and we often end up back where we started, which is with a complex funding formula for good reason. But anyway, no, I wouldn't want to dampen the ambition here to rip it all up and it will all be nice and simple. We can trust everyone. Or can we trust everyone? Because there will be these things called local skills improvement plans, which will bring colleges and other providers together to agree how gaps can be best filled. But of course, these local skills improvement plans are actually owned by the employer bodies, and that's where the statutory legislation will come in to enforce them. So this sentence for me is a little bit misleading because it won't be the colleges and providers. Well, the colleges and providers will have to agree to sign up to them, but they can't really afford not to. I'm not sure they'll exist if they don't. So it'd be interesting what would happen if they chose not to sign up to it. I presume a very swift change of leadership would ensue. We will reform the accountability system to focus less on process. Now, what do they mean by on process? I've been mulling this over. There's parts of this white paper I wish they just spoke in a language that made sense. Accountability system that focus less on process and more on the effectiveness of provider performance and the outcomes they achieve. Answers on a postcard why what you think they mean by the accountability system currently focusing on process. What does that, do they mean you're being held accountable to meet your funding allocation? Is that a process? Or do they mean that an achievement rate, whether they pass or not, is a process of passing or not on the qual? It threw me a little bit, this sentence, by what I wish I'd have asked Keith Smith back 5 weeks ago, what this means to focus less on process. I think what they intend to do, and I did ask Keith about this, but I didn't press on the process work. I think what they intend to do is to try and move away from so much reliance on the achievement rates and whether people pass or not. As we know, 100% of the funding is paid out on that, and they're already trialing new models. You look at the bootcamp funding methodology, much more is funded on the basis of whether they progress into work, at least for those that are out of work. So I put that in red. I think this could be a big move, which would be very, we've not seen this in FE. We've seen it over with DWP, but the DFE has been very reticent to do anything beyond a little bit for traineeships. They've done very little around job outcomes. By taking the outcome-focused approach, providers will be incentivized to review their provision to ensure at least a meaningful employment for their learners. So incentivized to review their provision to ensure at least that. So I'm not sure it will actually end up existing in the funding formula, but I suppose they could try that. That would be a bold, I think it should, but I'm not sure they'll be bold enough to do that. But it could be they use some of these outcome-focused metrics that do already exist to determine who to give their contracts to, or much more to determine that. But they've always had trouble with that in the past, partly because the metrics are very out of date, and partly because many providers, particularly independent providers, don't have a track record to determine. I could see a move away, as we'll come on and look at, a move away from the newer providers in some senses, unless it was a real gap that no one else could fill. Simplified and better targeted funding. For me, state the obvious. Many people have said this, that is why people come on my training sessions, because FE funding is complicated. There's a debate to be had. I think they've obviously stated this as fact. It needs simplifying. I think it probably does need simplifying, but that needs to be done very, very carefully, I would argue, to not constantly repeat the mistakes that have taken place. Some would argue anyway, every 5 years when they do this. Establish a new funding landscape and consider the role of subcontracting. Very, very difficult to simplify this when you've devolved funding and the funding formula and the funding rules and the audit to mayoral combined authorities. So I have my doubts about whether this, for a provider with multiple funding contracts, is going to feel any simpler. They're going to consult on how to do this. I pull out these two paragraphs because for me they contradict each other. The first paragraph to me is saying that they need to explore this idea of it moving to a needs-based approach rather than historical allocations just rolling over. So that creates less stability. And I'm not clear on this paragraph why they're only referring to mayoral combined authorities and not the national funding here. And then the next paragraph, directly the next paragraph, then says we need more stability, we'll have multi-year funding regime. So this looks very confused to me, and this does not, to me, I've been doing this a long time, this to me does not look like it's been thought through, and it suggests, as it has done every time I've seen this in the past, the idea of who wouldn't want a stable funding allocation over 3 years, but it's never happened. And it's really not, I don't think, ultimately in the agency's interest to do it, because if they want to give the money to someone else, they've hamstrung themselves in doing so. So for many years, so I can't see this ever happening I just think it's warm words. But they're going to develop proposals, and we look forward to the consultation on this. But as I say, been doing this 20 years, heard it before, and whilst I'd like to believe it might happen, the fact that you've got two paragraphs contradicting each other like this suggests to me they've not really scratched the surface properly, or even thinking this one through. More effective support and intervention. So this is where we start heading into the governance area. So a new meeting, this has now been officially announced, and a new annual meeting between the ESFA. For me, the key point here is and the FE Commissioner team and all colleges. When I was working at a college, we met with the ESFA local, well, it was then the Local Learning and Skills Council. We met with them once every couple of months. So many ways going back in time now and only having once a year, which puts a lot of emphasis on that one meeting. The big thing for me is there'll be someone from the FE Commission team, and also that the government want the chair of governors to be at that meeting as well, which I think is significant. My guess is it will be just like the meetings that they were a year ago. And I'm sorry to be cynical, but I think they will be a complete waste of time. And the college will tell the ESFA what they want to hear, and the ESFA will say thank you very much, and we'll all move along. And it won't really affect anything had the meeting not taken place. For a small proportion of colleges where intervention is necessary due to performance of financial issues, we'll put in place a shorter time frame for intervention, which I suspect means removing the principal and some of the board more swiftly than has been the case to date, or shuffling them along more swiftly and putting in their own people, I suspect. We'll seek to strengthen powers, as you see here, of the Secretary of State for Education to intervene locally to close or set up colleges, corporations, bring back college changes to membership or composition of governing bodies, or review leadership, or take other actions where there are long-term weaknesses. Not clear here whether any new legislation would be needed, because as I understand it, the Secretary of State has these powers already, but has chosen not to use them for a couple of decades. So, but this will obviously be one to watch. What does it mean to strengthen the powers? What powers do they not already have? As you can see here, I think these two paragraphs link to each other. Swifter action, because the Secretary of State will just be more ready to, more readily replace, and may well be able to do so for other reasons, like if they feel that a college is not performing well enough against the local skills improvement plan. And then these are the key 5 bullet points around governance, which I'll just leave on the screen for a little bit, which we'll be covering in more detail, no doubt, in our own conversation. We've got 2 governance experts that we'll be talking to. The general wisdom, it would appear across government and in other parts of the sector, is that college governance is very weak, very poor. Clearly not in all colleges, but there is a general concern that the wrong people are in the wrong posts, and this seems to be something that the FE Commissioners team have been experiencing when they've been going in and what they've seen. So they're talking about refreshing existing guidance on appointments, making it clear who should be, who shouldn't be, more training, new requirements, regular reviews, possibly more paid. We have seen more of this. Right, very swiftly, not much to say on this that I haven't already said. There's a page on independent training providers, which for me basically says, you know, you're not the key players in town, mate, because your progression, you know. And then we kind of got potentially controversial suggestion here that the research shows that progression is not as good. Seems to be trying to justify the demotion of independent training providers by saying that the progression at independent training providers is not as good at independent training providers, and that there's too much poor quality or financially inadequate providers, and that, interestingly, that there are just too many of them, and an ongoing commitment to clamp down on subcontracting, harmful subcontracting practices. And then nothing we didn't know here, investing in, again, specifically spending a couple of billion on on capital, on buildings in the main and equipment for colleges. But obviously this is an opportunity with the capital funds to look to link it to particular reform programs like T-levels or like the college business centres. I suspect Strategic Development Fund will come with capital and so on. And then finally, just a reminder, FE put together a little timeline of key things and when they need to happen. Some of them.
There was a problem with the app.
Oh, that was my watch talking at us. Some of these things not happening for quite a long time. We'll need some legislation to implement this lifelong loan entitlement. That's why it's taking until 2025. We'll obviously need legislation for these local skills improvement plans, although they'll look to pilot certain things. But in terms of the Secretary of State's intervention, the first time we see that might not be for a good few years. So hopefully that was a useful summary of Chapter 4, which I've just rattled through, but we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about it now. The first person I'm going to invite on the screen, who you should be able to see now, is of course Graham Hastings-Evans, our Chief Executive for Nocn Group, the partner organisation for these webcasts. Graham, fantastic to have you with us and joining us again. I'm going to hand over to you now for 5 minutes or so to give us your thoughts on the white paper and this particular chapter. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nick. Good morning, everybody. As you say, we're focusing on responsive providers. I noticed that doesn't mean awarding bodies and EPAOs and other people that provide things to the sectors. It's definitely training providers. You've given us a really good introduction to it all. This one's interesting. I think in some ways there's a lot of nice words in this chapter, as well as the threats. But there's not a phenomenal amount of detail that sits together and makes any sense. Lots of promises of carrots, particularly for colleges, but with some legislative sticks around the corner. And although private training providers are mentioned, this chapter is predominantly about colleges. So what are some of the carrots we're promised? Yeah, simplified funding streams. Yeah, we'd all like that. Like Nick, I've been around, well, slightly longer, Nick, 30 years. So I've seen this type of promise before. It's never ever comes about. And to be honest, it is complicated. You're quite right. If we're to be fair, it will inevitably be complicated. But if we can streamline it as much as possible, that's obviously a good thing. More certainty over funding would be a good thing. That I can't remember the number of times I've seen promises on multi-year settlements. They've never come to fruition. So I suspect they won't happen with this one either. We're going to see some strengthening of governance in colleges and investment in the estate, as has been mentioned, linked to T-levels and other things. All of that sounds hopeful. And I think the annual strategic discussions, they sound a bit woolly, I suppose, is the way it comes over to me. Relaxing the ring fencing is good. Reporting, moving to more outcomes. Presumably that will be how many people have you got into employment and what's the quality of that employment. I guess that's the area that people will start to look at if we're looking at those rather than how many qualification certificates have you issued. And I think there is a recognition of the importance of training providers in the ecosystem, particularly on apprenticeships, and that they will have a role in the local skills improvements plans as part of this, and the intention to try and improve the way all of that works. But you know, it's going to be interesting to see how a nationally based independent training provider links into the local areas. And in that respect, I was starting to muse about how many of these local improvement plans we're going to have. There are 343 local authority areas in England. Well, that's a lot if we're going to have that. There are 10 mayoral combined authorities, 44 chambers of commerce, 38 LEPs. Notice none of these figures are the same. And then, you know, if you're in the CBI, there's 12 regions within the CBI. So we could end up with, I don't know, 50 local improvement plans. And I think, you know, there's some logistical challenges in terms of handling that, getting a consistency with the industrial strategy into all of those plans for all of the different sectors in the economy, and how a national independent training provider can actually input in any sensible way into the local skills plan, or even college groups. You know, we talk about, I'm talking about national independent training providers, but you know, college groups are spread across big geographical areas. So I think there's some real trials in all of that. And what we need is early clarity over the way the country is going to be split up into sensible economic and travel to work areas in which these local skills improvement plans are embedded and tied in. And we will also need to see the same powers of access to funding per capita in these areas as we've got within the mayoral combined authorities, so that we do see some levelling up and some equality within our society. So I think there's a lot of thinking to do around this particular aspect of it. And if you can't work out how to break the country up into these areas, how can you start to apply legislation to local skills improvement plans in any meaningful ways? So this all seems a bit too sketchy for me at the moment. Nice to see the money being promised, but it's been promised before. And we've obviously got the sticks as has been laid out by Nick, powers from the Secretary of State to intervene in colleges, closing colleges, opening new colleges, changing the government bodies, and for ITBs, you know, sanctions through the contracts and registers and all of those sorts of things. So you know, still a lot more detail to come through. It's also quite sketchy, I find, this particular chapter. Some nice words, but pretty sketchy. And inevitably for this, all of the devil's going to be in the detail. And we can expect consultation, yeah, spring 2021. Don't know if anyone's noticed, look out your window, spring's arrived. It's quite sunny today where I am. So I guess that might be the end of spring, but we'll just have to wait and see, won't we? And this chapter is very much a wait and see, can I have some detail, what's it really all about chapter. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Graham, as always, for partnering with us for these webcasts and your views. I'm going to now invite to join us Fiona Chalk, the National Head of Governance at the Education and Training Foundation, Head of Governance and Development, Kurt Hall, who's the Governance Advisor for the Association of Colleges. And there's a nice link between Fiona and Kurt, because the ETF is running a governance development program, which is being, as I understand it, has been commissioned out to the Association of Colleges. So you two should be fairly familiar with each other by now. And I'm going to invite as well Mark Taylor, who is a lawyer, a partner for Eversheds Sutherland, as I understand it, the main law firm that particularly colleges use. And Mark and I go back about 7 or 8 years. You may have seen us share a platform talking often about, well, as you would expect, about contracting and subcontracting, other bits and pieces, which does feature a little bit in this chapter, along with other very relevant things. I'm going to start with on the governance thread first, if I may. So we'll start with you, Fiona. If we can just give you 3 or 4 minutes just to give your opening thoughts about anything. It doesn't have to be about governance or about chapter 4, but that's the focus in the main for the next 45 minutes or so. Fiona, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Nick. Interesting to hear your views and various comments around the chapters. I think this is some interesting bits to pick up on this, particularly around, as you said, about the local skills improvement plans being put on a statutory footing. I think, to quote Keith Smith from your earlier webcast, where he spoke about, you know, engagement of employers and being a core part of the purpose of skills delivery in this space. And yet I always hark back to the core purpose of colleges as charities, and for governors as charitable trustees, you know, their purpose to improve education and deliver on education in the interest of their primary beneficiaries, which are students. You know, ETS has a charitable purpose to improve the education and training for post-14 learners, and colleges are charities too. Yes, they're exempt charities, but they still have a charitable status. they're still required to comply with charity law, and although they're not required to submit their accounts, they're exempt from submitting their accounts and reports to the Charity Commission. They are charities, and so it is their lawful purpose to meet the needs of students first and foremost. You could argue that it is not a lawful activity for college corporations to have as their primary purpose meeting the needs of employers or indeed the local or national economy. You know, any benefit to employers or the economy has to come as an indirect outcome of corporations' activity around meeting the needs of its students. I mean, yes, we would expect to see some synergies between that duty and any new statutory duty, but I think we've all been in the sector long enough to know it's not quite that cut and dry and it's not quite that neat. And I think there's a real inherent tension here. I've certainly been contacted by a number of chairs who said, well, hang on a minute, you know, I'm chairing a college that's maybe focusing on sport, maybe they have football academies, maybe they're heavily involved in creative industries, maybe they've got a huge adult learning, community learning with their college, and although they may be meeting the needs of their students under charity law, they're concerned that what happens around if they're not sufficiently fulfilling the local skills improvement plans. And does that mean that they're going to be under intervention? Which duty trumps which duty, if you like? Which voice in the boardroom is going to be loudest, that of students or that of employers? And I think that's a really important point that we need to have further fleshed out. And it will be interesting to see how DFE square that circle.
Thank you, Fiona. Really interesting. A number of people chiming in and saying on the chat, what I was thinking in my head was, actually, you've got a really good point. And I noted Mark, the lawyer, nodding furiously away. So I don't know whether he's just agreeing or it's something he was going to bring up as well. We'll find out in due course, no doubt. Before we do that, Kurt, if we can come to you, and same again, if that's all right, just a few minutes with some opening remarks.
I think what we have, I think, it's been described by everybody as interesting. We've seen in this white paper, and in particular this chapter on governance, something trying to link, some big reforms that will happen around, LSIPs and other things to an accountability structure or increased accountability that will go along with those reforms. And I think, as everybody has said, there's some detail that's lacking in terms of how those two will hang together and whether the proposed reforms in this chapter will actually meet the challenge of, some of the bigger picture items that they're trying to propose. And so, again, as more detail comes out of that, then we'll see whether or not the kind of movements that will happen on the governance side and strengthening governance and accountability will be able to flex and adjust, or whether more significant changes will be needed. And I think that's a worry and a feedback that I've been getting from colleges and college governors and chairs, that yes, we have some things in here that we can all get our teeth into, that we can all get on with, and many of them are things that have already been happening. But when it comes to the bigger reform picture that is set out in previous chapters, will governance and governors and boards really need to make bigger shifts and bigger structural changes to be able to accommodate those those changes? How will cooperation look with people that you're competing with? How do governors kind of integrate those two and start looking across that piece? So I think it's certainly an interesting chapter, and we can get into some of the detail a bit more, but that's my view on it.
Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate that. Mark, over to you. You can talk about governance or anything you like, but you've got about 3 or 4 minutes just for your opening remarks, please, Mark. Just to repeat, so we have Fiona from the ETF, Kurt from AOC, and Mark is our lawyer from Eversheds, Sutherland. Over to you, Mark.
Cheers, Nick. I'm mainly just really excited with how Fiona jumped straight into the technicalities of charity law and exempt charities. It's your whole webinar series must have been building up to this moment. This is brilliant. I love this. On Fiona's point, I completely agree. I mean, colleges are exempt charities. The boards of colleges have to further the objects of the college and the charity. If the government is giving colleges a different mission, how does that fit with their existing charity law duties? I have to say it's even more complicated than that, though. Governors have an obligation to further the objects of the college, but nobody tells them what those objects are. You actually have to look at what the statutory powers of a college are and guess what their charitable objects are, which isn't ideal at the moment, but this could make things even more complicated. On a general level, though, I think I agree with all of the other panelists, and particularly with Graham. Graham said the devil's in the detail. I'm paid to be cynical. I'm a lawyer, I pick things apart, but actually I'm really positive about this. There's a lot to like in the white paper. If we're talking about more money, we're talking about better regulation, simpler regulation. If we're talking about better funding and simpler funding, then these are all things that colleges absolutely need. The problem is, I think it's a very ambitious white paper. So it looks like there is going to be a lot more in the way of regulation of colleges that's mooted here. So squaring that with simpler regulation will be difficult, if not impossible. If we're looking at simpler funding, then how do you have simpler funding and simpler regulation if you're introducing a new funder and new regulator through the LSIPs? It's really ambitious. If I were to criticise the white paper, it would be that this isn't a white paper at all. A white paper is a draft piece of legislation, and this is far too vague to be a draft piece of legislation. But that's good news in that it does look like there's a lot of detail to be worked out. So I think that's where we can all support the DFE, we can all support the ESFA. I think there's a big role for the AOC and ETF in shaping this into something that really will be good for the sector.
Thanks, Mark. That's useful, and there appears to be a degree of consensus about the charities point, which is helpful in a legal sense, because it always gets tricky when two sides don't agree on the law. One person's been pointing out as well that a number of independent training providers are also charities, and they may be the sort of charities that are under the Charities Commission. It actually struck me, we don't have Graham with us at the moment, but it struck me that the Nocn and many awarding bodies equally have charitable status and are regulated by the Charities Commission. So it's slightly broader, I think, that point, than even just colleges, and more complicated than as well, given we've got different regulators. Why don't we start with the Charities Commission? There's a bullet point on paragraph 126, which I'll read, which says, we will work with the Charity Commission to review how the existing system operates for paying board chairs, to consider the possibilities for enabling board chairs to be paid in specific circumstances within the confines of charity law. Now, at the moment, as I understand it, you've got to get permission for the Charity Commission, from the Charity Commission. We've got it, for example, Leslie Davis has just been appointed as chair at Hull College as an interim in the hope that she'll get paid, but that needs to get signed off. What's the view around the pros and cons of paying board members? We'll start with Fiona.
Well, this is a very hot potato, Nick, that's been around in the sector for a long time. So thank you for lobbing that one in. You're right, absolutely. You know that it does require Charity Commission permission to pay chairs, but we have been here before. Certainly, when I was working with colleges through the area review process, there was a specific agreement at that time between the sector and the Charity Commission to allow payment of chairs over and above their role of simply being a chair. I say simply, it's not a simple task at all. So we have been here before, and obviously in Scotland as well. You know, there's an agreement with charity commissions there to pay chairs, and so it is something we could look at. But you know, there's very fors and against it. There is an argument that it attracts a better caliber of person. I don't know that there's evidence specifically for that. And then there's concerns that actually it will only attract people who are interested in being career NEDs and don't actually bring perhaps the commitment that a volunteer might bring to the sector. So there's fors and against on both sides, and I don't suppose we've seen the end of this conversation for a while.
Which do you have a fence to which you are on a side of, Fiona, or shall I not draw you on that?
I'll take the fifth on that one, Nick, thanks.
Fair enough. Kurt, same question for you around pros and cons
So yeah, I agree with Fiona there. I think the sector is split, and I've been having this conversation for a long since I've come into this sector formally about 4 years ago, and it's always been popping up, and so it's interesting that it's being addressed directly. My understanding is at the moment there is no plan to really put the broad swathe of paying chairs on the board. It is paying chairs in certain circumstances. So where there are mergers or where there's kind of interventions or interim support put in, those are the circumstances where they want to make it, as it is now, automatic. They want to look at particular circumstances where it will be automatic, where you just write to the Charity Commission, and they will still, in my understanding, want you to write to the Charity Commission and advise them, and it will be like an automatic kind of like, okay, tick box exercise, yeah, you can do that. And these are circumstances under which this will happen. So that's what they've put on the table. Now, as to whether through consultation it will morph into something else, that's a different question. And in terms of positives and negatives, I think, you know, I've heard quite a few arguments around how does it change the liability that governors will have when they're no longer voluntary, because and I think Mark will be much better placed to comment on this. But when you're a governor on a voluntary status, there's an understanding that, you know, you're volunteering your time, you tried your very best. As long as there's no malfeasance, there's an understanding that, okay, you know, you use reasonable skill and care when making this judgment, it failed. When you're being paid to do it, the expectation is different. It's no longer about reasonable skill and care. You actually have a duty, and then there's also the issues around accountability, like who is a chair going to be accountable to? You know, is it the DF? So there's a whole lot of questions around that. But then others come back on the other side and say, well, actually, we want the more you know, structured accountability, because if I'm confident in my ability to deliver and to be a capable, let's say, you know, chair of audit or chair of a board, then I don't have to worry about that increased, you know, liability, because actually I know I'm competent at doing what I'm being paid to do effectively. And so there are arguments on both sides, and I think it's split because we have you know, quite a few board members who serve multiple different NHS where they're and so forth. So they're all so because of that crossover where different sectors do different things, we get different opinions on it.
You had one of those at the AOC, if I recall correctly, in terms of the NHS and your chair for not very long. Sorry, that was a bit cheeky. I think, I mean, I've raised this first because I think it's really important. I mean, I spent some time with Gavin Williamson fairly early on in his tenure, and I very much got the impression from him and his special advisor at the time that they saw governance in colleges as a real problem. It's not something that they've spoken very publicly about, but I think it does come through in the white paper, and that they think, I guess because they've heard this from the likes of the FE Commissioner's office, that when they go in, they find the chairs very weak. They haven't held the accountable officer to be accountable, which is typically the chief executive principal, and they've typically turned around and said, "I didn't know." We've seen this recently with Hull College Group. You know, the "I didn't know" defence, "I wasn't told" defence. Mark, NHS seems to quite successfully pay and professionalise their boards. Why not in further education?
Oh well, the NHS comparison is the best reason why that we should be remunerating chairs, in that if you have a highly skilled person who could go off and be the chair of an NHS trust or chair of a college, at the moment they get paid for one, they don't get paid for the other. So that is the obvious reason why colleges do at the moment pay their chairs. Should we be doing it? My view is it's the wrong thing for most colleges most of the time, because the principle of governors as volunteers, as charity trustees who are giving up their time selflessly for the benefit of their community is the thing that is actually probably the greatest strength of college governance at the moment. But that doesn't mean that you should never do it. I'd say we've got the balance about right at the moment. So where a college needs a paid chair at the moment, it tends to be happening. But I think we could perhaps look a bit wider at other circumstances in which it is used. For example, if a board has a particular weakness in skills or a particular weakness in its diversity, could we use the ability to pay a governor as a way of filling that diversity or skills gap? I think it could be really useful for that. I also agree with Kurt, it would be useful to have a simpler way of getting permission to do this. But like a lot of things in this white paper, we've already got the solution. It is something I've been doing in higher education for years. It is possible to write into the constitution of a college the ability to remunerate governors. So you only need to get permission for that once rather than applying whenever you need it. So Fiona's right that the AOC did great work around the time of area reviews. We're getting a few chairs remunerated, but that demonstrated actually the weakness in this system, in that some of those chairs, the college applied to remunerate the chair, the college eventually received permission for the chair to be remunerated, but by the time that permission came through, area review process had finished, and so the college no longer had the reason to remunerate the chair and couldn't do it all. So I think we could tidy it up, but we've got the balance about right.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective. In sticking to this important theme, but almost linking it, so around the kind of the composition of the board, but linking it to Fiona's original point around the mission in the charitable status. My reading of this chapter, and perhaps I didn't pull this out particularly strongly in my opening remarks, is that we can quite swiftly expect to see an expectation that the makeup of college boards looks more like the makeup of a local enterprise partnership board. I think we could see some strong expectations that, much like a board must have it depends on the corporation, must have 1 or 2 staff members, must have 1 or 2 students. I think we could see stipulations that must have 1 or 2 local company people, whatever that looks like, or someone from the Chamber of Commerce or whatever. What avenue does that take us down, Fiona, in terms of colleges' missions and their purposes, once the makeup of the board changes?
Yeah, this is a really interesting point, really, Nick, isn't it? Particularly given that we've spoken already about the similarities with the NHS. I mean, if you look at the NHS foundation trusts, their boards, which you could say were equivalent to our corporations, are made up of just 2. They're made up of the execs and they're made up of non-execs, with a majority being non-execs. They don't try to be a representative board. I think there's an issue around governance in colleges that, we're trying to be a representative board as well. Whereas in a foundation trust, they don't do that. They're paid, highly paid, skilled non-executive directs. And above them, they have this stakeholder council, which is the stakeholder group, which has elected and appointed members on it, which fulfills that stakeholder need. But its purpose is to hold that trust board accountable for local delivery. So it kind of addresses your point, which is it does give us place-based accountability, but with local autonomy. And so whether that is something we need to look at further in FE, I mean, I'm always slightly concerned when we talk about board composition that you must have 1 of this, 1 of that, and 1 of the other, because to me, a board composition should be shaped on your strategic plan and your risk register. You need to have the skilled people on there to address the challenges and opportunities that you're facing at any particular time. So trying to get, a particular agreement for what you will have across all college boards, I think, is probably not the ideal way that we should be going.
Interesting. I can see the issue with quotas, but on the other hand, taking you back to that accountability angle, if colleges can't be trusted to get that balance right, then the government steps in, and that's when they set minimums and standards. it's squaring that circle, coming back to, I think Mark raised the same point as I did around, will this be the time when they really do trust colleges? I'm not convinced that this is that moment, not least, where we are in the kind of interventionist nature of the reality, maybe not so much the rhetoric, but certainly the reality. It is quite interventionist with about a third of colleges at the moment.
I think this is the whole purpose, isn't it, for strengthening colleges that they talk about in the white paper. ETF as the expert body for professional standards and developments, is looking to work with the Department for Education to bring competency frameworks to the sector to give what they're talking about, a clearer position on what good governance looks like, and I think that's a really positive thing. That is essential for the sector, but I think it does give an opportunity for us to actually reframe governance and how governance operates within the sector. So we move away from this compliance-based mindset and much more towards looking at governance as a lever for value creation and actually driving the performance of organisations.
Absolutely, I was going to bring Kurt in there around because Kurt, you're working very closely with the ETF, aren't you, around governance development? Do you want to talk to us a bit about the current state of the college board's kind of competency and what the plans are going forward?
So just stepping back a little bit on the point around employers and sector industry people on board. When that was mooted and in conversation with a whole range of governance professionals and chairs, and I think I had about 80 of them on the line when I put this statement out there, and I think every single one of them said we already have employers on our board, and we fed that back to the DFE. It's like there are a few minority of colleges that don't think in this kind of think about the complete mix that they need to bring, but I think most people do. I mean, even if it is a matter of course, just thinking, okay, who can I have? Somebody who's quite high profile locally tends to be recruited on, and that tends to happen generally anyway. And I think what we need to see is and what I think this white paper is driving for, maybe not directly, but what AOC and ETF and other partners can work together to do, is having that more well thought out vision for bringing together, or strategy for bringing together the board as a whole unit around achieving what the outcomes that they want. In terms of your specific question, in terms of what our plans are, so I think the part of the wording around this chapter was quite careful in the sense that they said strengthening governance. And I think the point they wanted to pick up, and they said it in conversation with AOC, is that actually a lot of the things that are in here are being done already, a lot of the proposals. So in terms of the governor training, the governance development program that the DFE fund via the ETF, and that we're partnering with them to develop, they want more programs coming out of that. They want additional elements in that, and they want it to be, they want additional robustness in it, and that's very well and good, as long as there's going to be some funding that's going to be coming down the track to enable that to happen, and that's perfectly fine. And I think there are plans, and we work quite closely with the ETF at trying to think forward. We were just having a conversation last week around some of the ways that we'll be looking at developing structures and frameworks to support governance in the longer term. And I think, once we get to that point where we can't have one size fits all, because I think colleges have to really develop structures and models, or develop from structures and models, things that fit their context. I think we can have, examples of good standards and examples of good practice that we put forward and work and enable them to see what works best for them in their own context and what will help them to meet their objectives. And so we're constantly working to do that, I think. alongside our partners.
Yeah, I think you make a good point, Kurt, that much like a lot in the white paper, many of the things mentioned in chapter 4 around governance are in train, like as you say, that looking at the framework of skills and competencies.
Yeah.
So that's useful to point out that in a sense it's not new, but it's got a long way to go to be concluded, let alone really properly rolled out. Mark, if I can move us away a little bit from the composition of boards, we've spent a good bit of time on that. Let's talk about legislation. What's your view? You know, you're a lawyer in the FE space for a good many years. What's your view on the you know, do you agree with me or not? What's the point of this white paper? Because that's what it's about, isn't it? It's about the subsequent legislation that will come.
No, I don't think it is at this time, and I hope it isn't. I hope it isn't because, actually, as Kurt just touched on, I think we've got most of the framework and the government has most of the levers which it needs already for a successful sector. It's maybe just using them a bit better. So what's this white paper about? Let's be positive. I would say this is about the government showing that FE is central to its education plans. It's giving FE its moment in the sunshine. It's promising more money and publicity for the FE sector. And at the same time as this white paper came out, there were 3, 4, 5 other skills documents and notices and reviews into further and higher education. And it was really interesting how all the positive noise was around further education, a lot of negative noise around the higher education sector and their future funding prospects. So no, I think this white paper is about giving FE its moment in the sunshine.
So what might the chapter in the legislation that Keith Smith described, what might that chapter look like in terms of the local skills improvement plans and then the powers of the Secretary of State? We've talked before, you and I, in the past about the 1992 Further and Higher Education Act, which is kind of where you have to go right back to in terms of statutory Secretary of State powers. Are you saying that you think that there might not be any, they might decide not to have new powers, or the new powers won't add much?
I think there probably will be legislation that arguably we don't need. And that's not a criticism of any government. It is that successively we've seen that actually, if we want to make a change, the easiest way to do that is to pass a law, because then it looks like the government has done its bit. When actually the trickier bit is implementing that. So it's a bit like companies and strategies. Any company can draft a nice looking strategy, it's implementing it which is difficult. So the Further Education Commissioner, well, the Secretary of State through the FE Commissioner, already has the power to merge colleges, already has the power to sack the board, already has the power to tell a college what it has to do, but the DFE chooses not to exercise that power. So I would argue that we don't need any new powers, but the weakness of the current system perhaps is that those are pretty nuclear powers. So the department works by consensus with the threat of those nuclear powers if a college doesn't comply. We might see some softer powers which would be easier legislative tools to use rather than going for those nuclear powers on that side.
Yeah, it's interesting because I wonder whether the power hasn't been used to date, because I think it typically would have been used for financial failure, for which the board would have then blamed the government for putting them in that perilous position. Going forward, if you think about the local skills improvement plan, perhaps the rationale for actually enforcing those powers wouldn't be financial. It would be more outcomes, curriculum based, and maybe the government see themselves, you know, having more cover, political cover, as it were, and have fewer local MPs knocking down their door whenever they've tried to make the nuclear, to take that nuclear option in the past. Am I drawing too many lines between dots here, or does that sound plausible? No.
I think you've got a point, but I think it will be done a different way. So I think you've got a point in that, of course, the government will want to make sure that its policy decisions are followed through. So it will need levers to enforce those. I don't think there'll be legislative levers. I don't think there'll be legislative levers, partly because you firstly get into the charitable objects issues that Fiona started with, forcing a college to do something which isn't central to its mission. Secondly, we'll all remember new flexibilities, new freedoms, and the idea of getting college pension deficits off the public books. I think as soon as the government starts telling a college, here is your outcome, you need to go away and achieve that, or we will force you to do so, I think we're then very much getting back into the realms of colleges being public institutions for those purposes. So I think it's more likely that it would be achieved in the same way as the government currently achieves most of the outputs it needs, which would be through grant funding arrangements, funding rules, and funding contracts. I think that will be the way it would be done. But again, that's where I can see another layer of complexity with another funder and another set of rules for the sector, which is probably not what we need.
Interesting, Mark, point you make there about the levers. Well, I've worked in this sector 20 years, mostly around funding, and the word lever, not in the context of a learner leaving, but a lever in terms of actually pulling on something is very familiar to me around funding, and much of the funding incentives really are levers for change. And obviously the biggest of those levers is just to cut off access to funding. Now, what we tend to have in the past is colleges and training providers potentially with lots of different contracts for different things. They might have one funding body, but they'll have a study program contract, they'll have an AEB, an adult education budget contract. They might have several adult education budget contracts if they've got a grant one and a procured one. Then they've got an apprenticeships one. Then they've got a separate now a completely separate traineeships one. Now they've maybe got a boot camp one. They might, in due course, we may end up seeing things like T-levels being spun off. We've got UK Prosperity Fund coming to replace ESF and so on. Now, all these separate pots, you could switch one off, and the college might just say, fine, we just won't do that anymore. Or the independent providers, as many have in the past, I've seen many walk away from traineeships. Fine, we just don't do that anymore. That's not a lot of power. Simplification could, if it resulted in there being far fewer separate pots, be much more powerful lever through switching off a sort of funding contract, as it were. Fiona, your governors, the board, in this space, they need to be very mindful of anything that could be an issue around going concern and around the viability of the institution. Where do you sit on this point around intervention and what could be under a simpler system, a situation for the board where if they don't do what they're told, there just isn't a college. Whatever they think their mission is, they have to go left, even if they want to go right, because if they didn't go left, there would be no income, no college.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point, Nick, and it goes back to the point I made right in the beginning, didn't I, about this inherent tension between what these different duties are going to, lawful duties are going to be. I mean, I agree with Mark really, and that, I don't think regulation is really the answer. I don't think that, there's no way that statutory duties or detailed regulation can mandate how every critical discretionary decision is made in a college. The minds of men and women generally never stop being ingenious and entrepreneurial about finding spaces in regulation, let's be honest. And I think that ultimately, that's why we kind of need to rely on the independent mindedness of skilled governors that have undertaken, training and development, so that they can direct strategy, monitor performance, control risk, and generally do the right thing as agents of all stakeholders under a fiduciary responsibility, to do the best thing for their college and for society.
Yeah, and I guess it comes back to that issue around the kind of dichotomy or the oxymoron that is trust and accountability, and where on that spectrum we are going to end up. I think also human behaviour with the Secretary of State, any Secretary of State, and it's probably just literally is human behaviour, is to end up wanting more on the accountability side than on the trust side.
Yeah, I mean, we saw this, didn't we, when mergers happened, and we started having college groups and local boards, and where does accountability lie and where does responsibility lie, and ultimately responsibility, decision making has to lie with the people who are ultimately accountable. Yeah.
Kurt, one of the things that the Association of Colleges proposed, or at least the independent commission did, which was very closely aligned to the AOC, and then I think the AOC then kind of backed up with their own suggestions, was around governance almost being moved up to a kind of, you know, more a group level if it wasn't already at a group level, so that these sorts of decisions could be made for the locality. So we were talking there about levers and so on. So rather than trying to lever individual institutions in a locality, you're levering the locality, which I suppose is the point of the local improvement skills plan. But there's no, although it's in statute, there's no board for the plan itself. Do you think AOC? You were going to say yes, I know you are. But do you think AOC were onto something in terms of having more governance at that slightly higher level?
Yeah, I think we're onto something there. But I guess this is the point I was making before, to say what we don't see, because I don't think it's been, you know, how it works, how it will work hasn't been, you know, I mean, the detail just is lacking at the moment, and that's not a criticism at all, but we don't have the detail to know what is going to come down the road, and there's too much complexity regionally at the moment, and there are different models that, again, when we're doing, you know, when the independent commission was doing its work, and I was having conversations with them, and a part of the conversations that they were having with a range of different colleges and looking at different models, there are just so many different ways of doing these kind of regional corporations blocks, that the feedback, at least from governors, has been that, you know, what works in that model won't necessarily work over here because of how we, you know, work together or how we compete. And so we will need something different. And so, again, it comes back to whether or not we can have a one-size-fits-all, but the core of it being that we have to move to a more collaborative system and integrate the delivery in a more organized way. I think, you know, and be having more conversations between providers, between governors of providers, and them, you know, interacting with each other and interacting with the communities that they serve. And I use that word communities quite broadly, you know, not just where they live locally, where they're based locally, but, you know, the communities around as well, that those interactions need to take place at a very strategic level. And so for me, there needs to be, you know, involvement of people who are on boards at that regional strategic level. And so what that looks like, or what that will look like, is going to be different in different regions, and how it will play out, how it will operate will be different. But
that's very complicated, Kurt. Yeah. I'm not sure the Secretary of State's going to accept anything that doesn't fit neatly into a box.
Oh, yeah, okay, but yeah, but at the moment that is what it is. It is a little bit all over the place. I mean, for want of a better term, much better term. But you know, there are probably ways in which, as we play this out a little bit, it will come together. So we will see. We're talking about pilots, and we're looking at, you know, we're having policy groups looking at this at the moment. So it's a bit early to say, but as we see what works, people will gravitate to that model.
Because some areas have sort of done it already. You look at Leeds, to some extent Manchester, some extent Sheffield, sort of Birmingham, but sort of not. Probably Birmingham's a bad example. London's a terrible example for all the obvious reasons, where it hasn't happened, and I'm sure it never will. And then you've got all the areas where, you know, all the more rural areas where, you know, there is only one place to go to the college, really. So it, you know, and this is an ongoing challenge in terms of trying to create frameworks that don't fit in it, even just in England, let alone if we were trying to open this up to the devolved nations, as the AOC is obviously responsible, you know, have members across the United Kingdom. For the last 5 minutes, I'm gonna open this up a bit more to talk about the provider base. We're talking about complexity there, and I thought there was an interesting. There's only 3 paragraphs in the in the white paper that's specifically dedicated specifically to non-colleges, or what are described as independent training providers. And it stood out to me that the white paper described it as and I quote, a crowded landscape that does not always deliver high quality provision. Now, we know there are about 170 colleges, if you count the college groups once, but there are, according to the white paper, 1,250 independent training providers, but I would put that more like 4,000 if you counted everyone that was paid some ESF funding, either directly or through subcontracting, and therefore indirectly. I'd put it at about 4,000, especially when you consider that quite a number of those are not even counted by the ESFA because they receive less than 100,000 every year. So if I were the Secretary of State looking at this, as many have done in the past, they've wanted to streamline or simplify or just have fewer qualifications. I could see the same eagerness under a completely new regional model to do the same with the provider base, and it will make the local skills improvement plans a lot simpler if there are only 4 or 5 providers in them and not 50, including 20 that are working nationally and named in 25 other local skills improvement plans. Where are we going with this? Because in the past, the agency have tried to hold fewer contracts so they could have fewer staff, but all my reading in the last 5 or 6 years is we've gone in the other direction, and I think we're seeing this now. Traineeship tender, Mark. All I hear every day with these big providers that have got £3 million contracts to do traineeships in 6 months is they're phoning around everyone and anyone and saying, "Can you help? Can you help?" I mean, the government are going to be relying on subcontracting forever, aren't they? We're not. It's just pie in the sky to suggest that we can somehow be a sector that doesn't subcontract.
Yeah, I think the government in its own policy documents has admitted that there is a place for good subcontracting. So I don't think it's something we're going to see disappearing anytime soon. I'd say if there is a will to rationalise the number of independent training providers, then that's very hard to force from a legislative perspective. I just don't see that happening. I think if the government does want to go down that road, then they'll do what they did with funding amounts and funding caps for independent training providers, saying that you have to have X amount as a minimum threshold. And actually, the local skills improvement plans, they could use that funding, or they could route funding only to their preferred providers. So as soon as the government starts exercising those financial tools for making sure that there are only a limited number, the ones which don't win the contracts and the ones which aren't awarded any funding, that they won't have any future. So you will naturally see a rationalisation in the sector.
But I've been doing this a long time, like you, Mark, and it doesn't work. The higher you make the threshold, the more likely you make subcontracting. And every time the threshold's higher, the providers that don't subcontract miss the numbers, and then the ESFA say, "Oh, you should have subcontracted." It's just cyclical. It happens every time.
Well, you could say that shows that there is a good reason that why subcontracting works. But no, if the government wants to
get money back, for sure.
Yeah. Well, if the government wants to do it, I think it would be able to do it, and it would limit the number of subcontractors. Whether or not that's a good thing, whether or not it achieves their policy objectives, I don't know. But if you look at when the £100,000 limit was brought in, at that point, we suddenly had a lot of training providers and colleges approaching us, where you had training providers which realised they didn't have a future independent from the college, which subcontracted to them anymore. So we saw a lot of acquisitions and mergers around that. So it does work to limit the number of providers, but whether that then achieves the policy objectives, I couldn't tell you.
But come on, Mark, it only limits the number of prime providers. It only limits the number of contracts that the ESFA holds. What you end up with is you go from, say, 50 contracts with the ESFA down to 20 with the ESFA, but then you end up with 100 new contracts between the colleges and the subcontractors. I mean, you just pass the problem further away from Ofsted, further away from the assurance bodies, and then you get FE Week with more pages to fill.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing. I mean, it would be possible to introduce rules to limit the number of bodies to which a college could subcontract, but I don't expect to see that level of detail.
No, we've had over a year now since the conclusion of the subcontracting consultation, and all we've heard is yeah, we'll do something. Really tricky one, and it's a tricky one for governors, coming back to that point, because that there will be torn right now, many of them, between not spending all their AEB or picking the phone up to a subcontractor to try and spend it in the next 3 months. So it's a very live debate for governors right now, who should have a very important role in who is in deciding strategically who is actually and where the delivery is going to take place, because it's at the heart of the mission for the college. You know, if you pick up the phone and deliver it 300 miles away, does that bear any relation to your mission and what bring us right back to Fiona's opening remarks around the charitable purpose? Subcontracting, certainly the purpose may be to avoid giving the money back and to make the balance sheet strong, but it's not always clear to me that it's aligned to this idea of a local asset delivering to its local economy in some instances. So really really interesting to kind of hopefully try and bring that back full circle, whilst also ticking a box that we talked a bit about the independent sector before lots of people start shouting at me as we come to a close that we only spoke about college boards. On that note, just a minute each, if that's okay, just with any closing remarks. We'll go in reverse order now. So we'll start with Mark, then Kurt, and we'll finish with Fiona. Mark, any closing remarks from you?
I'll finish as I started. This is all about the implementation. It's an incredibly ambitious paper, would be the positive way of saying it. Negative would be, you could say, the government's trying to have its cake and eat it. So how this is implemented and enforced on the sector will be really important.
I'm gonna steal Kurt's thunder, because I know he's about to say devil will be in the detail. Kurt, final remarks from you.
No, I'm going to say that this is we see this. AOC, we've had this conversation. We think it's an opportunity, and the lack of detail. I think you mentioned this before, and actually, it's something that our Chief Executive David Hughes has said many times. The lack of detail gives us an opportunity to have these conversations to kind of shape the direction of travel. And so, for us, it's an opportunity. It's an opportunity to engage boards, chairs, governance professionals in steering the direction of travel. And so the white paper, provided things continue in the direction of travel that they are now, we think is a positive intervention.
Yeah, more consultation the better, I think, I would definitely agree with. Fiona, some closing remarks from you, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, just building on what Kurt says, actually, I think this white paper is a huge opportunity for those operating in the governance space, not just to consider actually what their purpose is, but also to consider the work of the board and how they do it, and also to consider reframing governance away from a compliance exercise towards an outcomes-based function of the college, which can really add value to the organisational performance. So lots of opportunities, and as you say, plenty of conversations to be had.
Fantastic. Well, I'm delighted that we've ended on a high. Definitely all of you agreeing there around the opportunities, but obviously, given we are where we are with the white paper being high level, then now is the time, as you've said, to get involved in shaping that detail, so that it's not a devil, it's an angel. That's the terrible way. Sorry, I don't know what I did there. Anyway, and that's the kind of the point about these webcasts, isn't it? Is it's an opportunity to talk about these things, to have many hundreds of people tuning in, many thousands will be watching this back later. So thank you to all of you who've joined us live. Please use this opportunity to leave me a little message in the questions box, ideally saying something nice about the webcast, because I like to show that to my boss. We're nowhere near Christmas bonus time yet, but I'm always mindful that I need my evidence base for that. And I also like to share that with our VVIPs, in this case today being with Mark, Fiona and Kurt, to let them know if it was a useful session. It was certainly useful for me. It was really interesting. I don't really get too involved on the governance side, and it's something I used to do training sessions, just high-level strategic ones, like at the away days and so on for boards, but I just haven't had the time for the last 5 or 6 years. But I always enjoy doing it and scaring the governors with proving to them that it isn't as complicated as they'd heard it was. They always appreciated that. Maybe that's why I don't do them so much anymore, because they don't want me to. The principals and the chief executives are quite happy with the boards, thinking it's all taken care of by the executive. But anyway, again, thank you to our VVIPs in Fiona, Mark and Kurt. And on that note, if you could leave me a little message as you go, but we are going to all say goodbye. Goodbye to everyone, and we will send the links around. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Bye.